This is I Don't Speak German. I'm Jack Graham, he, him, and in this podcast I talk to my friend Daniel Harper, also he, him, who spent years tracking the far right in their safe spaces. In this show we talk about them and about the wider reactionary forces feeding them and feeding off them. Be warned, this is difficult subject matter. Content warnings always apply. Hear ye, the podcast is now back in session, and welcome back to part 97 of the ongoing trial, Jack Graham's podcasting presenting style versus the listener's ability to even deal. And if you're listening to this, it would appear I'm winning, owing largely, I suspect, my brilliant self-advocacy, because the defendant who represents himself has a super awesome lawyer, probably. And I call my first witness, Daniel Harper.
I am definitely here, and I am willing to be put under oath. And you can impeach every sentence I say with the things that I said on a deposition 2 years ago.
Oh, and you're going to be impeached more often than President Trump, I tell you.
And I will be sure to say, well, look, I don't want to quibble over details. You know, that's not what this trial is about. Is quibbling over details. Yes, we are referring to the Science v. Kessler trial and Richard Spencer's beautiful testimony in which the plaintiff's attorney literally, says, asks him a question. Spencer answers the question, and then says, "Well, that's not what you said 2 years ago." over and over and over.
In fact, we have tweets in which you say the exact opposite.
Yes, not only tweets but sworn statements from a previous deposition. It's pretty glorious. Yeah, so. Yeah, we are not going to be talking about Science v. Kessler today. We have other things to talk about, unfortunately, as much as it would be fun to laugh about how terrible Richard Spencer was on the stand. Instead, I will include the next, days 6 through 10 of Molly's live tweets of the trial, if you want to go track and see what's been going on. And then, at the end of the trial, we will do a fuller episode. Yeah, that's where we are.
Yes, but instead of Science v. Kessler, what we're talking about this time, well, it's kind of it's back to an old subject of the show, isn't it?
Yeah, we do that a lot these days.
Yeah, we do. We'll run out of ideas. You see, it's a sure sign of a franchise coasting. Bringing back all these old villains. Speaking of which, we're kind of back on the subject of Sam Harris, particularly with reference to a guest appearance that Sam recently made on the Decoding the Gurus podcast with Chris Kavanagh and
Matt Brown.
Matt Brown. Exactly. Yeah,
I keep wondering. Everybody wants to say Matt Smith, but his Twitter name is Arthur Dent, and so he's Arthur Dent in my head.
Yeah, but, you see, this is why. You see, I'm a very old man now, and something like that just plays merry hell with my ability to remember anything. No disrespect intended.
No.
I'm to be honest, you're lucky I remember your name, Daniel, at this point.
Ditto, but no, it's fine. But we're going to be talking about Sam Harris actually went on Decoding the Gurus, and on their invitation. I guess, God, where to start with this? One of the things that kind of came out of some previous episodes.
Maybe the first thing to say is that this isn't going to be like a savage, brutal podcast war takedown. If that's what you're here for, you're not going to get it.
That's not, I was going to couch this in a slightly different way, and that is that one of the things that we. Certainly some criticisms that we got around episodes like 87 and 88 was that, we were going after good people making a podcast because they weren't as far left as we are, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And that's completely true. You have to be as left as we are, or you're doing no good in the world. That's our brand, right?
Well, if you're not as, to put it that way, if you're not as far left as me, that means that I disagree with you about stuff. So I'm going to say I think you're wrong about this. You see, it's one of those things. It's one of those things about being on the left. If you just say, yeah, I disagree with you about that, I think you're wrong about that, it gets characterized as, oh, you're attacking them because they're not as far left as you are.
Right. But, of course, that never, it never kind of comes the other way.
No.
Like when people are to the center or to, whenever they don't, whenever they criticize the left, there's never like a sense of like, well, you're just a radical center, like that never happens. Right.
No, that's just sort of inherently taken to be. I'm just what I'm saying is that I'm the real victim here. That's
exactly. So I don't want this podcast to be the, calling people out. That's not what we're doing here, right?
Apart from Nazis, obviously.
Well, not, but like Nazis.
Even that's not really.
Well, in fact, I think we might get into that a little bit. In terms of what are we doing here? What is kind of the goal of this kind of work, and what and what value are we trying to add to this? And what and so we might get into that a little bit.
Episode 97, we're finally asking, what are we doing?
It's a question I've had to ask a lot lately as we just kind of continually move into the space. But I never want this to be like a call out or anything like that. And I feel like people responded to some of the earlier stuff as that we're like calling out other podcasts and that sort of thing. I mean, we weren't naming people, but we were clearly like kind of intentionally being combative or whatever. And, for me, the point of like not naming, is because it's more about like the idea, like the strategies or the ideas or the rhetoric or whatever, wherever it's coming from. And, mostly when I was recording 88, I was thinking about, more kind of Twitter randos, kind of the general response from, kind of centrist IDW critics who don't get to the core of what's going on. I've been a fan of Decoding the Gurus since the beginning. And I went out of my way. I actually messaged Chris Kavanaugh after I saw that episode, even before I'd listened to it. I just said, hey, look, I think I'd listened to a little bit of it. And I said, look, I think we're going to do an episode just talking about some of this. And I wanted him to have the heads up, because they have always treated me respectfully. I feel like there's a working relationship there, and even while we disagree on certain things, and there's something I'm going to call him out for here in a minute. But even though we disagree on certain things, I mean, there is a back and forth there, and I think that's valid, that's worthwhile, right? And it is a good show. There's plenty of areas of disagreement and criticism, which I'm sure goes both ways. But it's a show I like as well. Yeah, and I've learned things from the show clearly.
Absolutely.
No question. Sorry, we're not trying to belabor this too much, but I do want it to be absolutely clear that that's not what we're trying to do here. And we're not trying to like pick fights with every other podcast or whatever. That's not the goal. And I think that because I was on Decoding the Gurus and I kind of have that experience, I think that to a certain degree, I kind of know how this production process happened a little bit. And, I did not like pre-litigate this with Chris or anything like that. I didn't discuss what issues I was going to have. I think I suspect he knows exactly what we're going to say here, there's no, but, so if I make errors of fact or whatever, or conclusions that are not warranted, then he can call me out for it. And that's fine. But I think that's enough preamble. I think we should get into it. Right. Yeah. This episode's genesis was Chris and Matt have a policy of any person that they talk about on the show, they kind of give this like right to respond. Right. And so they have had, kind of people come on and have that conversation with them in the past. And Sam Harris apparently heard an episode that they did back in the I don't have the date on it, but several months ago, and it's about Sam Harris and meditation is all you need. And it was about Sam Harris's waking up meditation app and the kind of some of his claims to sort of like forms of enlightenment and sort of the way that he was kind of acting very guru-like in that very specific space. And it's worth noting that Chris Kavanaugh's actual like academic work feeds into some of this, like some of the like sociology of religion. I'm not sure exactly kind of where his actual research interest is, but he is, he lives and works in Japan. He is familiar with Buddhism and in these kinds of practices, and he is familiar with this kind of stuff in his academic work. And so one of the things that kind of comes across as we listen to particularly this most recent episode with Sam Harris is that Sam Harris is completely out of his depth. And in terms of talking about certain issues,
he had a James Lindsay bug-eyed you know a lot about this moment.
It wasn't quite to that degree, but one of the things that they start talking about and it makes up a big bulk of the episode is tribalism, quote unquote tribalism in sort of like political alignments and that sort of thing. This kind of, and one of the things that Chris says in the intro to the episode, like sort of the post-recorded intro, is that like, well, what he wished he had done in retrospect is to like define the term tribalism a little bit more, because he was using it in the kind of a fairly technical academic way. And he was like actually citing to particular, academic research that, is about these things. And Sam is using it in more of a kind of generalized, like IDW, like, your tribe and my tribe and, sort of political parties kind of sense. And they're definitely talking past each other for a good like hour of this podcast, which is unfortunate. So, live and learn on that. Also,
I wouldn't hold out too much hope, to be honest.
Right.
That's aimed at Sam, by the way.
Right. Exactly. My other thing, there is that, I'm certainly also aware of the way that the term tribalism gets kind of used is, like primitivism or, like there's a racial coding there that I think, Chris is smart enough to sort of like, again, because he does this research and because, he would caveat all over the place that like tribe is not necessarily negative and that sort of thing. But it definitely, when you have a couple of white guys kind of talking about tribalism in generic terms and not kind of acknowledge there's some definite like kind of problematic elements to even just using this term for this, and they get racially encoded, and that's something that I always feel uncomfortable whenever people start talking about tribalism. It's nails on the blackboard to me, and I understand that it gets used in kind of technical ways and that there are ways of talking about it legitimately, but I do just kind of hate the term, and I'm going to try to avoid it as much as possible in this recording. But anyway, the structure of the podcast kind of goes, they spend about 40 minutes talking about specific criticisms that Matt and Chris had at the beginning of in their original episode on Sam Harris, and then move into sort of broader quote unquote culture war issues and kind of various issues that are kind of involved in that. I'm not going to talk too much about the actual meditation app stuff because, frankly, it interests me very little. But I do have some things, some very telling moments from that bits of the conversation, and we're gonna deal with that a little bit. But before we even do any of that, I definitely want to highlight this very specific one moment in which, as to kind of the bridge into the culture war conversation, Chris plays a bit of Ina Muhammad Smith's episode way back in the day, back in, I think, 2016. She had a conversation with Sam Harris when she was a fan of Sam Harris, and now she is a persistent critic and is a friend of our podcast. And this is something I'm definitely going to I'm going to get to something with this, but I'm definitely going to ding Chris. This is kind of the one moment where I'm like, yeah, you could have handled this a little bit better. But this is about 56 seconds long, and we're just going to play it here at the beginning, just to sort of like comment on it and get it out of the way. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I should probably issue a disclaimer before we go ahead, which is to say that I haven't actually listened to the episode. I've actually been quite unwell recently, and I've had a succession of catastrophes. Cars that suddenly don't work and hot water boilers that suddenly don't work, which has been a bit of a problem given that it's suddenly turned freezing cold where I am.
Yes,
and I've been both busy and dispirited, and every time I tried to start listening to it, it's just my brain just went no. So I'm gonna try to be careful and not run ahead and talk thereof I know nothing.
Fair. I didn't want to call that out, but Jack is not having a great week, and it's okay. I listened to this episode 4 times and pulled clips, so I'm very familiar with the contents of this episode because I listened to it several times in 7 days. So anyway,
let me give an example of what I mean. Sure. I would say a lot of people identified relatively early where Dave Rubin's partisan bias lay. Mm-hmm. Whereas the way that you spoke about him, and maybe the way to do it is, if you don't mind, I have a clip from a conversation you had a couple of years ago with Ina, a persistent critic of yours,
right,
who also is not super fond of us.
She went a little crazy in my view, but yeah.
Well, there's a conversation you had about Gadsad and Dave Rubin, and mm-hmm. I just want to play this little clip of it, and then I'll tell you what I hear from it, and you can tell me why I'm reading this wrong, if that's okay.
So the
fuck
reason,
you, Sam.
Fuck you very hard, Sam. Before we get into, I have a lot to say about this, but let's, for context, the only clip that we're going to play on this episode that is not from this particular Decoding the Gurus episode is from Sam Harris's appearance on Eric Weinstein's podcast, The Portal. This is from, I believe, episode 19 of The Portal. And Ina came up briefly. And I think it's worth a little compare and contrast here.
Yeah, there are people that I can't diffuse because I don't think they want the thing diffused. Like you went on this person, Nice Mango's podcast.
Yeah, that talk about a no good deed going unpunished.
There's just something.
I did my best to launch your podcast.
There's something wrong with that account because there's many ways in which it seems quite reasonable.
Yeah, and then it just degraded into mental illness.
Well, there's a personal nastiness about it that doesn't let up.
Yeah, and
a lack of charity and.
Right.
So back in 2019, Sam Harris goes on Eric Weinstein's podcast and refers to, and Nice Mango's is Ina, in case for anybody who wasn't clear about that.
That's Nice Mango's. Go and follow her.
Right, please go follow her. Go listen to her podcast. She's great. Friend of the pod. We like her. We like Ina. Even though we don't always agree on things. How that works.
Yeah. I'm sure she'd be happy to let up, Sam, if you just stop constantly spewing reactionary bullshit.
Right. And if you would, it's like her, she's doing this Woking Up series, which is excellent, obviously. Talking about her evolving relationship with Sam's material and about how she got into atheism, and came to appreciate Sam and, being critical of Islam, but then, also understanding larger political realities. And I'm not trying to put words into Ina's mouth. I don't think she would put it in quite that way, but recognizing that there's more going on than just, being critical of a set of, religious ideas. Right. Mm-hmm. The thing that really kind of rankles there is that Sam Harris has a real habit whenever he refers to Ina, and this has been, I believe several times on Twitter and in other places, but this one was the one that stuck in my mind. So this is the one I went to pull. He describes Ina as mentally ill. That Ina is not wrong or mistaken, is not, but mentally ill. Like he brings that up on a regular basis. That
which where to even start? I mean, firstly, there's nothing wrong with being mentally ill, and right? You can be right about stuff if you're mentally ill. You can be right about politics. You can be right about Sam Harris if you're mentally ill. That's of course not what he means. He means she's wrong because she's a crazy bitch. That's what he means. It's misogynistic and patronizing and just vile.
Absolutely, completely. Like I'm sorry to even play it, but I felt like it's necessary to play it to get it to put it into context, right?
Yep.
Because it's ultimately a way of dismissing very real criticisms, even if he disagrees. I mean, I don't know how he could disagree with the criticisms. She is so, well prepared and pulls so much material, and like is
exhaustive.
So exhaustive and meticulous about not ever saying the thing that he says she's saying, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that there's almost no refuting Woking Up, and Ina's larger criticisms. I mean, you could probably pull some like factual stuff and kind of, look, there's always some quibbling, but like
anything and anybody.
In terms of the overall criticism, she's spot on. Of course she is,
I've never known her to make a claim or anything that she didn't back up with evidence. And, you might be able to disagree, but it's never the case that you listen to what she proffers and say, well, how did she get there? There's always something there, and she's always got it. If she says it, there's she's coming from somewhere, and she's got something to back it up with. She's straight as a die.
And so, agreed, obviously. So when Chris Kavanaugh is very aware of, he if anyone has listened to more hours of the Weinsteins than I have, there are a number of people. Chris Kavanaugh might be number one, who isn't actually named Weinstein, So, he's
lying.
Or Hying, right? Or Marinos. That's possible. That was Edwards Marinos. So I found out blocked me on Twitter like this week. I discovered he blocked me on Twitter. I don't know. Okay, so whatever. Anyway, go back to the previous episodes about the Better Skeptics Project. I think he found that episode and was none too happy with that. But this is also like a technique that Sam uses on his persistent critics, and even like more generally, he's constantly talking about, well, there's confusion in other people's minds. You're just not thinking clearly. You see, and like me, I am thinking clearly and rationally, and I, have all the facts at my disposal, and I use the tools of evidence. But if you were just thinking as clearly as I am, then you would come to similar conclusions to me. We may disagree on certain issues, but ultimately, we just need to have like a reasoned debate. And if you're this stridently against what I'm saying, because I know I am behaving rationally and in good faith, you must be just broken in the brain. And so when he says mentally ill, he doesn't even mean like she's got depression or anxiety, So he's not saying like she's got some diagnosable kind of mental illness that could be treated. Not. He's saying her brain is broken, and the reason I know her brain is broken is because she's a strident critic, right?
And it's because she is a strident and a persistent critic of it. She pursues him, which is a completely fair enough thing to do. Because I made that joke earlier. She'd be happy to quit if you'd be happy to quit, Sam. That's actually a serious point, because Sam spends that's his job now. That's his career, is to fill the airwaves.
We're going to get into that a little bit here in a second, but continue.
Continue. To fill the airwaves with these bad opinions and these statements that are, factually inaccurate, and these interpretations that are highly dubious and damaging, etc. That is what he does, and he does it all the time. So, to say that Ina pursues him, it's true. He needs pursuing because he keeps doing this. So, we're incredibly lucky that there's somebody who has said, I volunteer to be the person to just follow him around and pick it all up. It's not evidence of crazy obsession.
I could not do Woking Up. Like, I would not have the patience to put together that many clips.
Well, as I say, I didn't even manage to listen to the episode we're talking about. It was too upsetting, the prospect.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So
it is a lot. Yeah.
Again, and again, this is the sort of, it's a criticism of Chris, right? That I'm about to make a pointed criticism, but I think it also points to kind of the issue that we kind of get at is like why you don't get into these kinds of conversations. And so again, while I understand exactly how this moment happened, because Chris Kavanaugh knows that there's a real kind of moment that the clip that he's actually playing from Polite Conversations is Ina asking Sam Harris in whatever, I think 2016 was when that episode aired or was released, about his kind of continued support for people like Godsod, and particularly Dave Rubin, who had recently left the Young Turks and who was kind of moving into this kind of right-wing griftosphere and was bringing on really nasty people. I mean, this is kind of like alt-right, but when the alt-right and alt-light were a lot less distinct, and there was this real kind of like moment in which, he was bringing on, Stefan Molyneux and all these kind of people, and just kind of giving them like the friendly, all G's and shucks, treatment, right? And asking Sam, well, look, if you're a liberal critic and you're like, why would you not call out people who are doing real harm in the world in this space with your independent platform? You have the ability to call out Dave Rubin, because you don't take money from anyone who's paying Dave, you know what I mean? Like, again, she doesn't put it in those terms. I'm going to put that episode in the show notes. You can go listen to that. I think it's a good conversation, but it's interesting now, certainly. But so Chris knows he wants to use this clip. He knows he wants to bring up Ina, and he knows this portal clip, and he knows that there's a persistent thing that Sam Harris does whenever Ina is brought up, and he calls her mentally ill. Now, note that he does not actually call her mentally ill. He says she went crazy from my perspective. Look at that.
Yeah.
Now, it's the same thing, like semantic. The denotation there is very similar, crazy and mentally ill. But, she went a little crazy. Like, she went a little haywire. She went a little, kind of off the rails. And so it's sort of softened in this context. Isn't that interesting? Not that it's not still despicable. I agree. Believe me, I'm not saying it's not despicable, but I'm saying he's sort of giving Chris Kavanagh kind of a way to ignore it to a sense, and I don't know how much Sam Harris was thinking about this. Obviously I'm not in the man's head. But to me, Chris needs, if he's going to bring up Ina, he needs to be able to defend her. And he does the thing of like, she's not such a great fan of us, I think. And, which is probably, there's some truth to that Ina can speak for herself, obviously. And if she wants to come on and discuss this, I'm happy to bring her on again, and we can have this conversation. If you're gonna, bring up Ina to Sam Harris, then you need to be willing to respond to that. If you care about, defending Ina, however you feel about Ina, against this really spurious, despicable accusation, right? Like, he knows this is going to come up because he's going to bring on the clip. And yet, because he's bringing Sam Harris on, and Sam Harris is a big, kind of podcast, he's a big get to get him on your podcast. I'm sure they got a whole lot of listens to that episode who don't already listen to Decoding the Gurus. There's no implied, do the thing you do, that's fine. But if you're going to, if he's going to say something like that, then you owe it to somebody to be willing or able to respond. And I get that what he's wanting to do is to sort of like avoid letting Sam Harris do the Sam Harris thing of like relitigating every single personal interaction he's ever had with anyone. Because that's what Sam Harris just does whenever he's kind of confronted with this, is like, well, and he does it over and over again in this episode regardless. But like, I think Chris is trying to get to this point of, I want to talk about some of the more higher level ideas instead of the more, some of the actual issues, as opposed to, kind of getting mired into these things. But that's sort of the limitation, I think. I don't know if I'm making myself completely clear here. I don't know. Maybe I think you had a similar example that you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have Sam on your show, then he's going to try stuff like this. He's going to do stuff like this. There was a Twitter interaction I noticed between Chris and somebody called @RationalGenius. I don't really know who that is, but it's somebody I think who follows me, and I think I follow them. The way you do with Twitter. And this person @RationalGenius was criticizing Chris Kavanagh over the Sam Harris appearance. It wasn't abusive or anything. And at one point, there's a tweet where they say, "It's frustrating how you treat this dude." I'm reading from the tweet now. "It's frustrating how you treat this dude with kid gloves. He insults Mehdi Hassan, Christian Piccolini, and others by calling them dishonest and worse, but you don't ask him for evidence for it, brackets, it's because he can't take criticism and lashes out like a true Hollywood brat, end brackets." And then Chris replies to that with, "Litigating all of Sam's grievances would have made it the sole topic of the conversation, and we would have had to listen to a recitation of all of their previous interactions from Sam's POV. you might imagine challenging his accounts to be simple and straightforward, ... And then he goes on in, you can imagine the next bit in another day.
Right. Yeah.
His point is, that would be incredibly time consuming and difficult, and it would derail the podcast, etc. Now, I have a certain amount of sympathy with that because
absolutely agreed.
I fundamentally agree with the criticism, but I also have a lot of sympathy with the response, which is that, we had him on the show. This is what I take it to mean anyway. I don't want to mischaracterize anybody, but I take it to be, we had him on the show because we wanted to get into substantive issues. But Sam does that Sam Harris thing. So, if we were going to stop over every instance of that, we'd never get anywhere. Right now. Yeah, that's true. That is absolutely true. My response to that would be probably that's one of the reasons why you don't platform the guy, because you know that's what he's going to do on your platform. Right. He's going to take advantage of the fact that he's on your platform, which, Decoding the Gurus has a certain reputation, a certain deserved reputation. Sam gets, in my opinion, Sam gets something from going on there. He gets the appearance, even if it's just reinforcing this to the people that already like him. He gets the appearance of being the guy who's prepared to have the debate, who's prepared to answer questions, who's prepared to go and talk to people that disagree with him and be reasonable and rational and all that stuff, which is so central to his shtick, his brand. That gets reinforced by going on this show that has this certain reputation. And what you end up with kind of just, it's just an integral problem to the whole project of doing this, I think.
Exactly.
Which is that Sam is going to do his Sam Harris thing on your show. And you kind of need to either do what they see. Again, I haven't listened to it, so I don't know. But it seems like what they did was kind of brush past stuff like that in an effort to keep Sam on the issues. Or you have to stop and address it. And it seems to me that that's a really invidious position to be in, that you've placed yourself in, because you kind of need to just let Sam do things like go around calling women who criticize him very well, very conscientiously, calling them mentally ill, or as I say, you just end up with that being the whole subject of the episode, which of course is not what you want. So,
well, and there are ways of
like a trap that's inherent in the whole idea of doing
exactly. And there are ways of, and look, we've brought people on the show who we didn't agree eye to eye with and sort of said things that I wish in retrospect I had sort of pushed on. I mean, you bring somebody on in this kind of context, it is, and it's sort of friendly, even if there's a conversation, even if there's some conflict, it is in a friendly space, right? And it's kind of like the issues, you bring on, like if you're making The Simpsons and you bring on Henry Kissinger, you had to be nice to Henry Kissinger, right?
That's it, really,
I mean, I'm not saying that Sam Harris is as bad as Henry Kissinger, but
few people are.
Yeah. But you just, again, I think we've made the point, but I think there are ways of sort of like interjecting and kind of going like, something like, look, I'd like to get to the issues here, but like, you don't really think Ina is mentally ill, right? Like, don't you think that's a little unfair? Like you can sort of bring it in, but then you're like batting him around and that sort of thing. It's just, again, it is inherent to the sort of fundamental problem. So I think we've made that point at sufficient length, and I think we should kind of move forward on this. So again, as I said earlier, there are basically two kind of broad, things going on in this podcast episode. The first is the talking about the meditation app and sort of some of the philosophical questions, almost epistemological questions around what he's doing on the app, and whether Sam Harris is kind of behaving like a guru, like a literal guru, and teaching people to meditate through this app, and like what are the kind of moral conundrums there. And I think this is I listened to it several times. I think this is kind of this is just not something I know a lot about. And so it's very difficult for me to really have a firm criticism of what's happening. It's the stuff that sounds the most like kind of, Sam Harris sounds the most reasonable talking about the stuff. Maybe that's just because I don't know anything about the actual content. But there were two moments that I wanted to highlight in this bit, in this kind of section of the podcast. And the first is one of the things that I've always said about these kind of like liberal centrist IDW heterodox types, and and what my fundamental criticism of this kind of whole style of conversation is who do you actually give empathy to? Who do you consider to be within the bounds of reasonable conversation, and who is kind of othered, and who is outside of that realm? And if I had the opportunity to have an in-person conversation with Sam Harris, it was going to be published on a podcast, I would talk a whole lot about his feelings about suicide bombers and the wars in the Middle East, and his long activism in those regards, and not even bring up the term Islamophobia, because he would respond to that in very negative, hostile ways, but just sort of draw out that conversation, right?
He would try to get you to bring the word in. He would try to bring the word in himself, because he knows that with the audience he usually plays to, he can turn that into a win. Exactly.
So I mean, there's a kind of a strategy there. But I mean, I have a piece in the show notes here, which is Sam Harris actually wrote in the not ultra conservative, but in the very conservative paper, the Washington Times, in December of 2004, in support of like liberal intervention in the Middle East, like at the beginning of the Iraq War, when things were even at that time not going well, and George W. Bush was getting enormous criticism. This is shortly after the 2004 election. In which he says, in this op-ed, in this piece, it is time we admitted we are not at war with terrorism. We are at war with Islam. That is not to say we are at war with all Muslims, but we are absolutely at war with the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Koran. The only reason Muslim fundamentalism is a threat to us is because the fundamentals of Islam are a threat to us. Every American should read the Koran and discover the relentlessness with which non-Muslims are vilified in its pages. The idea that Islam is a peaceful religion hijacked by extremists is a dangerous fantasy, and it is now a particularly dangerous fantasy for Muslims to indulge. It goes on like that. There is a link to this in the show notes. So that's how Sam Harris in 2004, and he still says the same shit today. I mean, I'm not calling him out for something he said 15 years, 16 years ago, 17 years ago at this point. Jesus Christ. This is very much a piece of like how whenever he is asked about this issue, this is how he responds to it, right? And he's been doing it for decades at this point. During this episode, Sam and Chris started talking about abusive guru types, like people who, kind of basically cult leaders. Cult's another word that's kind of gets complicated valences, and I don't like to use too much, but to simplify, cult leaders who bring people in and who do physically, emotionally, sexually, et cetera, abusive things to them. And spoiler alert, Sam Harris has a more nuanced view on those people. And I think we should play. This is fascinating. So this is a longer clip. It's about 1 minute and 50 seconds long, but I wanted to include this. This gets at something that's really interesting to me.
This is why this is such a strange area. It is possible to be genuinely abused by a malignant narcissist who also has really interesting esoteric experiences to draw from in his experience, because he was raised as a tulku and spent years in meditation, or he spent years in a cave practicing meditation, or he just had a real talent for it. So he's not merely a fraud, but he's also a dangerous asshole. And you can also get benefit from that encounter even while you're being abused. The cash value of all abuse isn't just bad outcomes psychologically for people. The place I've referenced this is in the account of Osho's, Rajneesh's cult that Frances Fitzgerald in her book Cities on a Hill wrote about. And Rajneesh is the perfect example. I think he was a genuinely insightful, genuinely smart person who was also genuinely dangerous and started a genuinely crazy cult. And yet, when you actually hear the experiences of Ivy League educated lawyers who went over there to fall at his feet and then were told to clean latrines with their toothbrushes and dig ditches in the hot sun, there was an ego-canceling effect of that demand on them, that self-abasement, which is psychologically interesting. I mean, their experience of devotion, even to the wrong guru, they experienced as freeing. I'm not disregarding the reality of abuse that goes on in cults, and I'm as critical of these scenes as anyone, but it is just a real quirk in the landscape of possible experience that someone can be treating you badly for genuinely bad reasons, and you can derive benefit from it if you're framing it in the right way.
First of all, note the use of the word crazy there in the middle. I didn't even catch that until I was re-listening to it now, but
wow.
This is the kind of thing, I mean, that's surely you have something to say here. You're like, go ahead. Like, yeah.
I don't even know where to start with this. I mean, look, the obvious thing to go for is the hypocrisy, as you pointed out. You know, much more capable of much more nuance, and I would certainly say much less deserved nuance when it comes to things that he likes, or you know, that he has a certain sympathy with, or on some level. Anyway,
I mean, Sam Harris spent like the bulk of his 20s like studying meditation in Southeast Asia, from what I understand.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, this is something, again, part of his backstory that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and something that I'm just not qualified to really get into. I would love to see, you know, someone with expertise in this area really kind of dig into, you know, what he was kind of getting up to, and how that kind of influences kind of the rest of his work.
My God, it's not like you need to defend cult leaders to also defend meditation. I mean,
right.
And I mean, exactly, you know, with Islam, the vast majority of people that practice meditation, just like the vast majority of people that practice Islam, are not dangerous cult leaders or terrorists or extremists. I mean, it's almost too perfect. It's almost exactly the same situation. You literally do not need to defend a fucking abusive cult in order to retain what is useful in parts of this idea. That is what millions upon millions of Muslims do all over the world. They do not need to defend the bits of the book that you take exception to, Sam. You know, they, in order to live a life which is based upon the good stuff. God, I'm being incredibly simplistic, but really, how sophisticated do you need to be?
Well, and how bending over backwards is he there to say, look, this meditative practice is so valuable and so powerful and so useful in people's lives that even in a like horrifyingly abusive situation, you still may be getting great benefit from it. And yet any conversation about Islam, any conversation about like the burqa, you know, for instance, is women forced into bags by patriarchy, etc., or by the men in their lives, you know, and you know, and it uses a smear against, you know, like kind of Western feminists who, you know, rightly or wrongly see, you know, the way that, you know, Islamophobia is used to justify, you know, horrifying military action by Western democracies against these people, and, you know, rightfully kind of start questioning, you know, exactly how hard they want to push for certain kinds of things. I mean, there's real nuance here, you know, in that situation, which Harris completely misses in every conversation for almost 20 years. He's been having the same fucking conversation about this with no nuance. I mean, I think the closest, you know, in this podcast at one point, he says, you know, if I had gone and I become a, you know, if I instead of becoming a Buddhist for a while, I had become a Muslim for a while, I would have possibly had, you know, I would have gotten benefit from that, and I would have gone on and perhaps become, you know, et cetera, you know, like he does kind of justify, you know, that sort of thing. And he will occasionally mention like kind of the beauty of the call to prayer and, you know, that sort of thing. But like, it's very thin rule compared to literal defending in any context, like literal, you know, abusive cults. Like, yes, go clean latrines with a toothbrush for a penny a day for the next trillion years if you're a Scientologist or whatever. That's cool because you're getting some kind of spiritual benefit from a great leader. And it's just so backwards. Right. It's just such nonsense. And I don't even think it's hypocrisy. I think it's so embedded in his mind that the power of meditation, the power of this kind of Eastern practice is so much a part of who he is that he just doesn't see it as something that could ever be negative for anyone in any context. And I think that's sort of the vibe I get from that moment is like, well, yeah, but they're still getting access to this great leader, this great teacher who's going to teach them good things, even if he's abusing them while doing it. It's just like, wow, how can you, like, if someone was saying about an imam, well, yeah, that imam, abused my child, but I got such spiritual benefit from his teachings otherwise. That's monstrous.
I mean, I think you're right that the impulse to defend the stuff that he's sympathetic to is just automatic now, and I think it's equally automatic and ingrained and impulsive now on his part to just find the worst possible interpretation of anything to do with Islam.
Yep.
Clearly.
Yep. And
to translate this into kind of my home language, how would Sam respond to somebody on the left who said, well, I'm as critical of gulags as the next guy, but the Soviet system did this, that, and the other, He would not have any truck with that, and he would be right to not have any truck with that.
How do you know people weren't actually being properly educated in those re-education camps while they were, digging in the snow in Siberia for 20 years? There's clear benefit here. Yeah, exactly. He wouldn't listen to that for a second. No,
of course not.
No, of course not. The more I listen to Sam, and particularly in this context, and I don't know, I had to pull it's so long, it's so hard to find the 30 seconds to a minute that really kind of gets at something here, because they kind of go back and forth. I mean, I think the episode is worth listening to because I think there's a lot there, but the more I listened to it, the more childish Sam Harris felt, and the more sophomoric and silly, everything that he was saying just kind of felt to me, over and over again. He talks about, they talk about tribalism. They talk about, why do you criticize this person and not that person? We'll get to this here in a minute, but, talk about, Dave Rubin. Why don't you criticize Dave Rubin? It's like, well, he's a nice guy. I sat and we had dinners together, and he seemed like a perfectly reasonable human being to me. And, then I hear people say he's saying these terrible things and hanging out with these terrible people on his podcast. And I just, I only have so many hours in the day. How much am I supposed to go and research these things and find out for myself? I mean, I don't know. He seemed pleasant to me. And it's like this, I get that, you're allowed to have personal relationships with people. I mean, we'll get to this here in a minute. You're allowed to have this. But also, you're a public figure and you have some responsibility to talk about these issues, at least in general. Even if you don't want to call out a particular person, you should at least be willing to have this conversation, especially when it's very, very public stuff. This isn't I found out Dave Rubin was cheating on his husband. It's not that level. It's Dave Rubin is platforming white nationalists.
And look, you are entitled to be friends with whoever you want. If you are consistently friends with people who are on the right, including the far right, then you don't get to be defensive about it when people point that out.
I mean, I think my just to doing this, I don't know, I'm going to get canceled. Cornel West, right? Cornel West is someone that I have some fondness for. Cornel West. I feel like he's I don't agree with him on everything, obviously, but he will go on Andrew Sullivan's show and talk about their various forms of religious faith, and say, yeah, I disagree with you on all these other things, and I think and call him out to his face, but say we can have a conversation about religious faith. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to be that guy, I mean, Cornel West does it, I think, about as well as anybody can. It's hard to criticize him when he's that open about it, I think, is the point that I'm making, It's like saying, yeah, I have a personal relationship with you. I disagree with you on a whole lot of stuff. I'm going to call it out where I see it. But that doesn't mean we can't, make some content together. I don't know. It's a complicated thing, but if anybody is doing it well, I think Cornel West kind of does it well,
That's not what Sam does. Sam, postures as somebody on the, center left or in the liberal center or whatever, despite the fact that he consistently hangs out with right wingers, including people who consistently and persistently launder far right talking points. And he will not listen to criticisms about it. He responds every time with bad faith and defensiveness.
Right. And will not really have any kind of conversations with anyone on even the nominal left. particularly the quote unquote woke left, the SJW left or whatever, you know.
He to the point where, he accidentally has people on his show who he considers too left wing, and he undermines them on the show after puts a caveat on the
Kathleen Ballou. Don't worry.
They're too woke.
We're not going to talk about Kathleen Ballou, but he did mention it. Kavanaugh did mention it on the show. That would be another thing I would ask him about, his treatment of Kathleen Ballou. I would love to have a very long conversation about that particular episode of the podcast. Anyway, let's move into our next clip here. We're going back to another topic here, but like this one just kind of, it's only 30 seconds long. It really kind of hit me in this weird way in terms of, you don't get a lot of sense of like how Sam Harris makes his money for, like whether it's just like an old trust fund from his family that was in television, or whether it's, book residuals or speaking engagements. I'm sure all this is his thing, but he doesn't talk about his economic life like at all in most of his content. Which, I mean, I don't talk about what I do for my day job either, but this was just a real moment. And one of the minor criticisms that Chris and Matt brought against Sam in the beginning of that episode, the first episode they did, was that Sam Harris has this sort of like free model of his waking up app. Is like he charges a certain fee per month for it, but he says, well, if you can't afford it, send us an email, we'll give you a year for free, and you can keep doing that as long as you want. And we'll just keep giving it to you, because we think the value of the product we're making is so great that we don't want anyone to not have access to this if they need it, right? And that sounds a little sketchy. And Chris called him out on it and said, like, in the original episode, said, like, it sounds like, okay, you get your first sample free, but most people are probably going to end up buying the product in the end, right? And that sounds fairly reasonable to me when I first heard it. Sam Harris disagrees. He claimed he was going to kind of send over the numbers to. I don't know if Chris ever got the numbers from him or not, but I'm willing to take him at his word on this. But it's he lays out a little detail here, and stop me when you hear it.
I have the same policy on my podcast. So there have been days where it's been 1,000 on each, but I mean, in the general matter, it's in the matter of hundreds on each every day of the year. And I literally staff, I think it's now an 8-person full-time customer service team in the Philippines. And 95% of their duties is to deal with free accounts. So I literally spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just to deal with how many free requests come in for the app and for my podcast.
Sam Harris is paying an 8-person crew in the Philippines hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, presumably, just to answer emails, just to do customer service work for one of his podcasts, for his app.
That's a lie.
Right?
Or he's doing incredible business.
I mean, he's saying he's getting hundreds, if not thousands, up to 1,000 is kind of the implication, like emails a day of people asking for, free accounts or whatever. And so he's literally got, a team of 8 people sitting in like hand typing in, giving people free accounts. And like, there are ways of automating that. Like, you can just, have people sign up for the free version and then, give them ads or something. I mean, there are ways around this. I don't know. Like, it strikes me as this, like, even taking it at face value, it means he's literally spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just on like fairly minor. This thing must be bringing in a fortune. You know what I'm saying? Like, if he's spending that much, that doesn't say like what his budget is. We don't know how many people are actually downloading this app. We don't know how many people are paying for it. And ultimately, any kind of model like this in which you have like kind of a free version and then a paid version, like you're ultimately sort of like building the infrastructure for everyone. Like once you've built the infrastructure, maintaining it is a relatively minor cost, all things considered. I don't know the exact economics of how you maintain an app. I mean, you've got to have developers and all that sort of thing. But I also found it interesting that it's like an 8-person crew in the Philippines. Like it's just such a detail, right? It's like, these are, I don't know. Like, it just struck me as this like very like tech bro capitalist thing to do. Like one of his buddies, one of these like, kind of neo-reactionary chuds was like, yeah, there's real cheap labor in the Philippines. I can hook you up with a company. It's just like, yeah, it feels like it's this real like line into like what's really going on behind the scenes to me. It's like, and obviously this is all like speculation and who knows what's true and what's not, but it was just such a, dropping that line just in the middle. And I was standing in the grocery store listening to that the first time, and I just stopped, and I was standing there in front of my cart and just going like, what the fuck did I just hear?
Yeah. What?
Okay. Next clip here, we're going to be talking about, so getting back to the Ina clip, because which we played at the beginning to sort of ding Chris there, and then there was a response, and this is about a minute long, and it's sort of Sam talking about why he doesn't call out certain people, which we kind of talked a little bit about earlier, but it's worth hearing this in Sam's own words. Okay, so let's just move into this.
They identified something you didn't see.
This is the early critics of Sam.
And you didn't see it because of your sympathy and interpersonal relationships, which is a tribal bias.
Well, no, I don't agree with the diagnosis. As I said in that clip, I was not in the habit of watching or listening to much of what Dave and Gad were putting out, right? So I was claiming ignorance even while I was saying the few times I had dinner with those guys, I didn't detect any right-wing allegiance. That was basically the extent of what I said there. Now, things have changed in the intervening years. I don't know if you notice what Gad says about me on social media, but the guy is working very hard to make a permanent enemy of me, right? He's just attacking me by name as a utter hypocrite and sellout, and I don't recall the specific allegations, but he thinks my reaction to Trump has destroyed my mind and made me a totally dishonest person. So that's what he thinks of me. So if we're in the same tribe, how durable was that tribalism if the guy hates me and he's expressed it ad nauseum?
Again,
he doesn't like me anymore. Ergo, it wasn't tribal when he did like me.
Yeah, this is the back and forth that we have over and over again, talking about this like tribalism, and well, I used to be friends with Gadsad, and then I didn't like Trump, and he did, and therefore I've changed allegiances now, or he's changed allegiances, and therefore I'm getting attacked by these people all the time. So how can we be in the same tribe? And I mean, the answer that I would have given is, well, you have the same enemies. Like you have the same kind of anti-woke perspective. You exist in this world, even though you argue amongst each other as to whether Donald Trump is great or not. Like ultimately, you have chosen a sort of clear set of like beyond the bounds enemies, and that is, well, people like me. I mean, that's people like us, and people actually looking at a systemic questions about racial issues, gender issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People who don't like Charles Murray, et cetera. Those, it's all the people who are having that kind of systematic approach to these kinds of issues. You reject all of that out of hand, and you refuse to even look at these questions, like almost by definition. And that's if there's a tribe, that's the tribe. And whether you disagree with each other on that issue, that's meaningless, right? I mean, that's what I would have said, and I think Chris tries to get there. I mean, I feel like I don't want to be that super harsh. I think Chris is trying to sort of be polite and sort of like kind of put this into, politer terms than I would. But like, I think he's trying to get there, but Sam just like every time they sort of start getting into this, Sam wants to relitigate some personal thing, or he wants to sort of add into some details of like, well, I had a private conversation with this person at the time, and like, you don't understand because like all you saw was what happened on Twitter, and you didn't see the private DMs that I got into. You didn't see the private emails, and you didn't see kind of all this background stuff. You didn't see me criticizing Brett Weinstein, in the background. You didn't see how long I like struggled with the decision to call out Brett Weinstein publicly for his support of ivermectin for treatment of COVID-19. Over and over and over again, you kind of see this thing, and it just like I just sort of asked myself after a while, how many times do these people eat together? Like, it's just this like constant refrain. He's like, well, I've sat down to a number of meals with Dave Rubin. And I'm like, are they having dinner parties like every weekend? Is there a club? Is there like a diners club? Like, I can imagine that like they did public events together or whatever. And so, okay, we're all traveling to San Antonio. We're all traveling to Seattle to do this conference. And so we sit and we have dinner together afterwards or whatever. I mean, I guess that. But it just strikes me as like they put so much like personal emphasis on, well, we've broken bread together and we had all these great conversations. And I never asked him about like, does he think brown people deserve to be in prisons? And, it's just everyone's question, instead.
It's never come up.
Never come up. Yeah. So, at the risk of going into the world of geekery a little bit too fast there, it is like the that episode of Red Dwarf where it turns out that 30 years later they've been dining out with Hitler and Stalin and Mao because they've just got the finest things in life, and it's great if you don't talk politics.
It's a personal thing. We don't talk about his work.
Not to say that Dave Rubin is as bad as Stalin, but
no.
But I mean, it is like there is you just constantly get this thing again: who's in the club and who's out of the club, right? Who's worthy of your time? Who's worthy of being someone that you engage with personally? And it does feel like when the more you like listen to these guys, like Ina is brilliant, but she is anonymous. She is nobody. She doesn't go and hang out in the green room of Bill Maher's show and hang out and have a conversation in glad hand with the boys. Unless you're on TV, you're invisible. I mean, that's and I hate to be like that open about that, but there is this very real sense whenever you listen to these people, it's like certain people are worth our time because they are public figures, they are public intellectuals, they are people, with serious academic credentials or serious cultural credentials or whatever. And if you're not in that social club, you're just you're not even worth paying attention to at all.
Yeah, Ina is also a Muslim woman or a woman of Muslim extraction, a woman of color. It's very easy for people like Sam to write people like Ina off in 100 different ways. And of course, immediately people who like Sam will be, the words Ayaan Hirsi Ali will be,
that's the very, I think he mentions Ayaan Hirsi. It's at least once, it might be twice in like separate context, and
I think the fact that he makes such a song and dance out of it is very telling because he uses her as an alibi. The point is, Sam will use the fact that Ina is who she is to get away with saying things like, oh, well, she's mentally ill.
Right.
And he will then make a great song and dance out of the fact that he's a friend and colleague with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and that is precisely because, I mean, again, I'm leery of using the word tribe because I don't like the associations. Certainly being who I am, I should be careful using it, but that's what we're talking about here. She's part of their club, and it's an ideological club. They are part of an ideological front. They are part of an ideological gang, if you like, who sing more or less from the same hymn sheet. It's ironic use of words. And the fact that, the fact that Gad Saad has now fallen out with Sam Harris because he doesn't like Trump. Harris has repeatedly said, he said this himself, that his big problem with Trump is that Trump is so bad in all these ways. He's uncouth and lawless and foolish, etc., is that he weakens the, I mean, he doesn't say this quite in these words, but this is what he means. Trump is bad because Trump weakens the fight against the left.
Absolutely.
That's the whole point.
Absolutely.
So this is an intra-tribe squabble over how best to oppose the people in the other tribe that they're at war with. Exactly. And that is obvious to anybody who looks at this in good faith. The trouble with Sam, of course, is that he doesn't use good faith. He is opportunistic and cynical, and he will use any distortion of arguments to get around and escape from things that are fucking obviously true.
Absolutely agreed. Yeah. It's ultimately, who is Sam Harris going to ally with? Like, if push really came to shove.
Yeah.
Godsod, Gadsod, or Ezra Klein.
Yeah, exactly.
That radical far leftist Ezra Klein, right?
Trump or Black Lives Matter, Trump or Antifa.
Yeah.
He wouldn't hesitate.
He is literally on record, and he hates it when you bring this quote because it's always out of context, right? It's always out of context. But I mean, it's a very famous quote that he made in which he says, words to the effect of, when talking about the threat of Islam, the problem is that the fascists are the only ones who are making any kind of sense on this issue, right?
Yeah.
And so what he means is, well, we need to get tougher on Islam. we need to overcome our resistance to being called racist or whatever, or else the fascists are going to take over. But ultimately, if it came right down to it, if it came down to letting radical Muslims into the country, or letting the fascists take charge, he's absolutely going to be right on the board with who does he consider the bigger threat?
Yeah, well, you put that back into context, it doesn't change anything, because the context is, the fascists are right about the fact that Muslims are a threat to Western civilization, and it's dangerous to Western civilization that they are immigrating to Western societies and changing their demographic makeup. That is the context. That is what he's saying. He's saying, I don't like these people, so I don't like having to admit that they're right about this. Well, right. The problem here isn't that you didn't say you didn't like them. You said you didn't like them. Fine. The problem here is that you also then said, but I agree with them. They're right.
Exactly. Well, I don't want to agree with the fascists here, but clearly,
but I have to, because
I'm just forced into this place. They're not on my tribe, of course. Yeah. I don't like these people. They're uncouth. If
only we could get the left and mainstream liberal society to understand that, as the fascists do, that Muslims are a deadly threat that we should keep out of our countries, then I wouldn't have to go to the fascists for a tactical alliance on this one. But I do, because you lot just don't get it yet. That's it. That is, put it back in context. That's still what it means.
Exactly. All right, wrap it up here. Got one more clip. Now, I was going to, because this comes up, talk about Stefan Molyneux, Holocaust denier, and Christian Piccolini. I was going to put that in this episode. It's really complicated. It gets into some really thorny questions. We might do that as a future episode at some point, and to kind of talk about those issues, because it's fascinating, and it comes up briefly in this podcast. The closer you kind of look at that, the more there's stuff to kind of dig into about what do we actually consider a Holocaust denier, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't have the time to do it for this episode. Maybe we'll do it in the future when I need something to prep quickly. But they also, to his enormous credit, Chris Kavanaugh brings up the Christchurch massacre and Sam's response to that. In opposition to the way he treated that issue of Dabiq, which we covered in episode 20. I can't imagine that our first podcast episode on Sam Harris was far from Chris Kavanaugh's mind when he recorded that. So we shall have to see. I don't know. There's no way of knowing that for sure, but it's very much right out of our episode there. So if that was useful, I'm very happy for that. But Harris was asked about how he treated the Christchurch massacre and, sort of the manifesto, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's worth, especially because this is I don't speak German, I think it's worth kind of digging into this a little bit. This is our longest clip. This is about 2.5 minutes long, but I assure you it's worth it.
The Christchurch shooting, you had various conversations with people relating to the motivations of the Christchurch shooter. In those conversations, there was a couple of things. First was that even a number of months after the event, I was quite surprised when you were talking with Kathleen Belew that you mentioned you hadn't read the manifesto. But yet you had a strong feeling that because it had some shitposting content in it, that we essentially couldn't rely on identifying the motive.
Didn't he blame like Candace Owens for radicalizing him or something?
But so here in that document, if you look at it, I mean, the title of it is The Great Replacement. He shot up a mosque targeting Muslims. And if you read the document, there's shitposting in it because he was a 4chan troll, but there's no confusion about him being a white nationalist concerned with the right race. And he's also an eco-fascist, but there's a deep swell of white nationalism. Now, when you discuss that, the two things I have is, one, you didn't want to ascribe so quickly that ideology as the motivating factor. You wanted to look at potential other explanations. And the second point was, and this might be a general point.
But wait a minute. But if you're going to say that I don't do that for jihadists, you're wrong. I absolutely extend the same principle of skepticism. It is absolutely not true of me to say that whenever a Muslim goes and kills people, I assume it's jihadism. That is absolutely untrue.
But if you have an issue of debate that describes the motivation, you say we should heed that motivation, what that says, and there's no ambiguity.
Only if it's credible. I mean, the problem with this case, and again, I didn't read the manifesto, but what I read was secondary coverage of it, which
that specific point. Why didn't you read the manifesto, given that you've talked about this on several occasions?
There's so many other things to read, and I haven't talked about it that much, and it just came up in this conversation with. We were talking about domestic white nationalism and whether, to what degree that's a problem.
He always has this dodge. He always uses this dodge. Well, I didn't read that. I don't know the details on that. I was just mentioned it briefly on the podcast episode I did with a world-renowned expert in white supremacy and white nationalism with impeccable academic credentials who, I mean, she was a little bit woke because she was talking about systemic white supremacy. And I don't know why that has to come up in this conversation about domestic terrorism, white nationalist domestic terrorism. But, I certainly don't need to read the manifesto. I mean, that thing was like, that was long. And I had secondary sources that told me this has nothing to do with white replacement theory. He was inspired by Candace Owens. I had a secondary source. Fox News told me that because they don't want to acknowledge that they fit into this guy's ideology. No, it's just Candace Owens. He's just crazy. In other places, it's like, no, it's just some nut job who snapped, right? That's what that was. Clearly, that's not anything to do with like great replacement theory and like fear of Muslims or anything like that. This is just some guy who snaps. You can't control for that. This isn't ideology driven. I know that because I didn't read the manifesto. I argued with everyone, the experts that I brought on my podcast. I argued with them when they told me that this is what it was. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's just, again, the longer I listen to this, the more childish and the more churlish and the more just like reactionary, just like interpersonally reactionary, just like this, like he's just got the thinnest possible skin, like just the skin of an onion just covering him. And he just like quivers with like indignation that anyone would dare question him. And yet every time he kind of like, anytime anyone asks him any question of substance, it's like, well, I didn't watch that episode, or I didn't read that, or I didn't, I was bringing it up as just a thing, just an example. And I don't know the detail. I'd have to go look into that. I can look into that for you. And I'll do that as soon as no one's paying attention anymore. Like that's the way it works. Every time you're either taking him out of context, he needs to relitigate the details of the interpersonal interactions that he had with individual people and how they have wronged him, or, well, I'm just not familiar with that material. And, there's just only so many hours in the day. Those are his two responses to every criticism you ever bring to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, that was my rant. Do you have, I'm sure you have other thoughts or,
I think that says it all, really. I just always remember reading The End of Faith for the first time, and it begins with this anecdotal account of a suicide bombing. And that's all he's got. He derives his conclusions about the phenomenon of suicide bombing from this anecdotal evidence, and what he deduces about what people must think based on what's written in the Koran. And there is an extensive body of sociological research on suicide bombing, why it happens, who does it, etc. Doesn't touch the sides.
And with people
it doesn't need to.
And with people with expertise in this subject, and I know some people who do kind of terrorism studies and etc. There is a healthy debate about how much does a belief in an afterlife really affect people's willingness to do suicide bombings, or it's an open question. But sure. Harris wants to ignore all of the kind of other features, everything else that kind of goes into the fact of people committing acts of terrorism, and then to only focus on the very last step of suicide bombing. How do you get this particular person to commit this particular kind of act? And everything else just gets left completely out of the conversation. And I don't want to straw man Sam Harris here, right? That's not what I'm trying to do. He does have a slightly more sophisticated view than this, but it's almost if we just find these people at the last step of their decision to have suicide, to go and commit suicide, and to convince them you're not actually going to get 72 virgins or whatever, then suddenly they're just going to wake up and not have any kind of anger about the situation whatsoever. And then we just won't have to worry about the real problems in society, which is clearly, Islamic jihadist terror attacks. This is the thing that I am deeply concerned about, and I'm deeply educated about. I've spent 17 years longer. I've spent almost 20 years talking about this in books and lectures. I have made literally millions of dollars on talking about this topic, and the sophistication with which I bring to this conversation is high school sophomore level conversation. There is nothing that matters other than 72 virgins in paradise. That's in fanaticism. There is any kind of more sophisticated take on it is just literally beyond the pale, ignorant. It's just namby-pamby liberalism, refusing to confront the real hard problem of that.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Big picture. Now, I played, 3 minutes of this 3.5 hour conversation, right? It's worth, I think, kind of asking the question, what do you get out of this kind of thing? There is look, we made content off of it. This is criticism of us kind of saying, well, you shouldn't debate these people. Well, then you also use audio of other people debating them. Well, once the audio exists, it's worth commenting on, right? It's not that I will never say in every situation it is completely valueless to ever have a conversation with anyone, or even a select group of people, or you're never going to debate this particular person or what, never ever talk to Sam Harris, because it's just going to fundamentally be wrong. There's no value to be gotten out of it whatsoever. That's not the point. The point is, we have done this before. We know exactly what kind of content we're going to get out of it. It is very easy to predict what Sam Harris is going to say at any given time, and why waste 3.5 hours? Why should Chris and Matt waste 3.5 hours of their time doing this when they're going to get similar results? Now, and I think Chris does, given the choice to do it, I think Chris does about as good a job as you would expect anyone to do. There's value to be gained, right? Mm-hmm. But how much value, and was it worth it in the end? Did you really get anything out of it? And again, if I was going to say, how would you do this? It's look, pick a high level topic, or 2 or 3 high level topics that you're going to talk about. Have some kind of moderator so that you don't have to be super nice to him. Have someone kind of sitting in the middle who will keep to this set of topics, and don't let him kind of go off into his interpersonal connections. Just kind of avoid that kind of dynamic, and just really look, I'm not interested in how Mehdi Hassan insulted you on Twitter in 2012. That isn't relevant here. I want to talk about the Christchurch massacre, and why you didn't read his manifesto. Let's have a conversation about keep it to those topics. And honestly, given my appearance on Decoding the Gurus, re-listening to it, I'm it probably would have been better we kind of picked a couple of like big topics we wanted to discuss and really not bounce around so much. It's really fun to sit and bounce around and have like complicated, conversations about like kind of whatever comes up, but it's less useful for an audience, and it's less useful in terms of the use of our time as well. Like it was fun. I think it's a good episode, but it's also like, well, maybe we could do this a little differently, and again, constructive criticism. I hope this gets taken as constructive criticism, because that's what it's meant to be. Okay, like that's what we're here for. Right?
We've spent a lot more time in this criticizing Sam than we have criticizing the guys.
Right. I mean, it's not. Sam Harris could go fuck himself. I have zero interest in ever having a real conversation with Sam Harris. I mentioned like if I were in that situation. Of course, if Sam Harris wanted to have a conversation with me in a neutral place, like, yes, please shower me with money. Yes, that sounds great to me. Please draw much attention to my podcast. I will happily go on and be abused by Sam Harris for 2 hours for the benefits of that. Yes, how much suffering for me to for the Patreon dollars it would surely shower upon me. Of course, I'd do it, but like, what's the value other than like that, And again, I'm not trying to, I'm joking about like financial motives, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's what Chris and Matt were really trying to do. I think I think they were trying to have a real conversation and really trying, because they are actually like college professors. They are actually have university positions. They have this kind of ability and willingness to really kind of approach him in this, sort of good faith collegial way. And I think that there is a use there to that as well. And we didn't really get into that too much either. But yeah, that's enough. I think that's enough.
So what are we doing next time?
I think, and I keep saying we're going to do more Nazis, but I think I really want to do Christopher Rufo. I really want to. I found a treasure trove of stuff. And frankly, if this episode is slightly undercooked, it's because the next one, there's probably going to be I have a full episode of Christopher Rufo material that never mentions critical race theory. Like that's how much material I now have on Christopher Rufo. So, so we'll probably end up doing a two-parter. They probably will not be together. That'll probably do a later episode about his critical race theory stuff, which has been really covered very well also. And so I'm not keen to sort of dive back into basically just reading the Great New Yorker piece and the Great Atlantic piece, or et cetera, so, but there's a lot of original stuff that I managed to dig up with Christopher Rufo. And I think it's really worth kind of going ahead and doing that this month. So that's the plan for the next episode. And then whenever I announce it, it always gets delayed, but that's the plan.
So. That's right. Yeah. People listening will be like, okay, well, we'll expect that maybe in 3 or 4 months or so.
Yeah. We'll expect that in 2023. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Lord, I hope that man is no longer at all relevant in 2023, but I don't get my wish on that regard very often.
There's no harm in hoping, I suppose. That was I Don't Speak German. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show or found it useful, please spread the word. If you want to contact me, I'm @_Jack_Graham_. Daniel is @Daniel E. Harper, and the show's Twitter is @IDSGpod. If you want to help us make the show and stay 100% editorially independent, we both have Patreons. I Don't Speak German is hosted at idon'tspeakgerman.libsyn.com, and we're also on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, and we show up in all podcast apps. This show is associated with Eruditorum Press, where you can find more details about it. The music was by Loon the Band.